Chapter 7. Ancient Psychic Phenomena continued. Having now briefly adverted to a series of psychic phenomena recorded in the Pentateuch, it remains to note the continuation of the same through the prophets who succeeded Moses. It is undeniable that the phenomena exhibited by the prophets were the same as those of Moses in all essential particulars. They were dominated by the same beliefs or suggestions, and the resultant manifestations necessarily corresponded, modified only by their different environment and the natural development and progress of the human mind. That the prophets were psychics is undeniable. Even the methods sometimes employed by them in entering the psychical condition were identical with those often required by the modern psychic when preparing for some signal demonstration. A striking illustration of this fact is found in the stance which the kings of Israel, Judah, and Edom had with the prophet Elisha. The king of Moab, who had formerly been tributary to the king of Israel, had rebelled. The latter had formed an alliance, offensive and defensive, with the kings of Judah and Edom for the purpose of bringing the king of Moab to terms. On their march through the wilderness of Edom towards the land of the Moabites, they found themselves in a region that was devoid of water wherewith to water their stock. In this condition, it became evident to them that they would soon fall an easy prey to the king of Moab. In this strait, the king of Israel said, "Alas, that the Lord hath called these three kings together, to deliver them into the hand of Moab." But Jehoshaphat said, "Is there not here a prophet of the Lord, that we may inquire of the Lord by him?" And one of the king of Israel's servants answered and said, "Here is Elisha, the son of Shaphat, which poured water on the hands of Elijah." Accordingly the three kings sought out Elisha, who, after making some disparaging remarks concerning the king of Israel, consented to do as requested for the sake of Jehoshaphat, the king of Judah. "But now," continued the prophet, "bring me a minstrel." And it came to pass, when the minstrel played, that the hand of the Lord came upon him. And he said, "Thus saith the Lord, make this valley full of ditches." The point to be noted in the foregoing is that, on this great occasion, when the fate of three kingdoms trembled in the balance, Elisha deemed it essential that he should have the aid of music to enable him to enter the subjective state and successfully invoke the name of the Lord. It is needless to remark that it was precisely the condition often required by the modern psychic to enable him to enter into communication with spirits of the dead for the purpose of obtaining their advice in cases of emergency. It is also worthy of note that the control of Elisha recommended a very common-sense plan for obtaining water, namely, digging for it, since the probabilities did not promise rain in time to relieve the distress of the three armies. What follows is illustrative of the essentially human and emotional character of Elisha's God. In this, finding water is but a little thing in the sight of the Lord. He will deliver the Moabites also into your hand. And he shall smite every fenced city, and every choice city, and shall fell every good tree, and stop all wells of water, and mar every good piece of land with stones. 1. And it was so. Now, the prophets of Israel were undoubtedly the best men of that race. They it was who constantly enforced the monotheistic idea, and thus saved Israel from lapsing into idolatry. The hereditary priesthood represented the religion of the time in its external forms and ordinances. They were the guardians of its organization and its ritual. The predilection which the people evinced for ritual and ceremonial worship often betrayed them into acts of idolatry, that is to say, into the worship of other gods besides Jehovah. It was the prophets alone who constantly resisted this tendency towards polytheism on the part of the priesthood and the people. This conflict was carried on in a more or less pronounced form from the time of Moses to the time of Jesus, and to the successful resistance of the prophets to the insidious inroads of polytheism into the religion of the Jewish nation, is due the final triumph of Christianity. It will thus be seen that it is to psychic phenomena that the world owes its first conception of a living God. The fact that the phenomena were grossly misinterpreted does not militate against the truth of this proposition. Its very nature was necessarily conducive to monotheism. Originating in the subjective mind of the psychic, it was inevitable that it should develop the emotional characteristics peculiar to the subjective mind. One of the most pronounced these characteristics, when it is not under the intelligent control of the objective mind, is that of monumental egotism. This emotion is developed in a more or less pronounced form in every phenomenal manifestation of subjective activity. The inevitable result was that, when once the idea was suggested that the source of the communications which were received by the psychics of the Mosaic age was none other than the deity himself. The character of the communications corresponded exactly to the psychic's conception of the character of God. That the first assumption should be that it was the greatest and most powerful of all the gods was inevitable, especially when the psychic was imbued with the idea of a plurality of gods. The Jews, in common with all surrounding nations and peoples, were imbued with that idea. Idolatry and polytheism were everywhere dominant. The gods of other nations, however, were purely objective conceptions and were represented by material objects of worship. The God of the Jews, on the other hand, was evolved from the subjective intelligence of the seer by means of psychic manifestations. Just how the suggestion originated via that the intelligence manifested in the phenomena was from God must forever remain in obscurity, nor is the question of any great importance. That it originated with the Jews at a very early period of their national existence is sufficiently evident. That the great characters of early Jewish history actually existed, and that the story of their lives as related in the Old Testament is substantially correct, may, provisionally at least, be taken for granted. The important matter to be considered is not the physical history of the Jewish tribes, but the history of the evolution of the monotheistic idea. In the latter, however, we may find internal evidence of the substantial verity of the former. Certain it is that in the God of Abraham and of Isaac and of Jacob we find the first crude conception of the idea of a living God, an idea which gradually grew in definiteness and magnitude until it was perfected by Jesus of Nazareth. The God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob was the God of the Israelitish nation. The right of other gods to rule the other nations was not at first seriously disputed. It is true that the proprietorship of the whole earth was early asserted, but the whole attention of the Jewish God was occupied in providing for the wants and promoting the welfare of his chosen people. This, then, was the first great step in the evolution of the spiritual man. The point to be observed in this connection, and which must be constantly borne in mind, is that this step in the evolution of the spiritual man was brought about by means of psychic phenomena, the phenomena of the soul. In the very nature of things it could be brought about in no other way. It is an axiom of the Christian Church that spiritual truth can only be apprehended through spiritual faculties. This is true in the sense that it is only by an observation of spiritual phenomena that a knowledge of spiritual truth can be blamed. It is obviously not true in the sense in which it is generally understood, namely, that spiritual truth must always be perceived by the intuitional faculties of the soul. For the spiritual intuitions or perceptions of no two human beings were ever exactly alike, and they often differ as widely as the poles. It is obvious, therefore, that where the spiritual perceptions of two or more persons do not arrive at the same result, one or more of them has failed to perceive the truth. It follows that no intuition of the ordinary human mind can be relied upon as a guide to spiritual truth unless the intuitions of the great bulk of intelligent beings point to the same conclusion. History furnishes but a single instance of a man so exceptionally endowed with the faculty of spiritual or intuitional perception of spiritual truth that his teachings serve as a safe guide, not only to his own era and people, but to all mankind for all time. Nevertheless, the intuitions of others cannot safely be ignored, for they often constitute important factors in particular cases and frequently lead to a partial knowledge of great truths. Thus, it is highly probable that intuition may have played an important part in the minds of the early prophets. It may have been an intuitional thought that led them to identify the intelligence manifested through psychic conditions with the living God. If so, it was a spiritual perception of a partial truth, for the soul of man is demonstrably a spark of the divine intelligence. Moreover, it is the divine instrumentality through which God manifests his will, and by which alone can his existence be demonstrated. The next great step in the evolution of spiritual man was taken under the dispensation of Moses. He inherited the controlling ideas of his forefathers, and was consequently dominated by the suggestions embraced in the traditions of his race. Hence the God of Moses was the same anthropopathic deity that was worshipped by Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. Nevertheless, a distinct and clearly defined step in advance was taken under the Mosaic dispensation. The code of ethics laid down in the Decalogue, rudimentary as it was, compared with the high standard of a later civilization, was a vast improvement on that of pre-Mosaic times. That this was largely due to the Egyptian education of Moses, there can be no doubt. If it be a fact, as there is no reason to doubt, that Moses was skilled in all the wisdom, esoteric and exoteric, of the Egyptians. There can be no difficulty in conjecturing the source from which he derived the code of rudimentary ethics which is laid down in the Decalogue. The scrolls and inscriptions which, in recent times, have been brought to light and deciphered, have demonstrated that long before the time of Moses the moral standard, theoretically at least, was very high in Egypt, as high indeed as underscore that of the Decalogue. The great distinction of the Israelites, a very great one, was that their morality, even if it dated from their residence in Egypt, had the effect of soon refining and exalting their religious ideas, as was never the case in Egypt itself, where, curiously and inexplicably enough, a debased form of popular religion retained its place side by side with a high development, in some quarters or classes, of the moral sentiment. This inexplicable difference in the reciprocal effect of religion and morality in the two nations is easily accounted for when we take into consideration the difference in the two religions. A refined code of ethics and morality has no necessary effect upon an idolatrous form of worship. That is to say, they have no, or comparatively limited, reciprocal relations. On the other hand, there was a necessary and vital relation between the morality and the religion of the Jews. The God of the Israelites, as I have pointed out, resided in their seers and prophets. Their God could be communicated with, consulted, and questioned, and the responses were the reflections of the mind of the one who consulted him. In other words, the God of the Israelites was just what they made him. If the prophet was dominated by a vicious code of morals, the responses from his God would be correspondingly vicious. If he was actuated by lofty sentiments and a pure morality, the responses from his God would be correspondingly elevated. Hence it was that the religion of the Jews under the Mosaic dispensation was comparatively refined and elevated. Moses was their prophet and their seer, as well as their temporal leader, and, as Mackintosh remarks, the great fame and reputation of the Hebrew legislator is sufficiently justified by the fact that he so clearly discerned the importance of ethical and religious principles as a means of giving stability to social organization, that he took the highest results of the most ancient civilization which the world has seen, and laid them at the foundation of his nascent state, that he snatched the torch of human progress from hands that could bear it no further, and passed it on to those of a fresh and youthful race, of a race which he may have freshened and rejuvenated by this very stroke of high policy. It seems probable, however, that the results were due, perhaps, less to high policy on the part of the great lawgiver than to the fortuitous commingling of the high code of ethics, which was a part of his Egyptian education, with the peculiar religion of his fathers. Be this as it may, the fact remains that the religion of the Jews, as it was in the beginning, as it was when the first psychic seer conceived himself to be in communication with the deity, contained the germs of an infinite development. For every advancement in civilization, every step toward a higher grade of ethics, every new conception of a nobler code of morals, had a positive, direct, and necessarily corresponding effect upon those psychic manifestations which they believed to be communications proceeding directly from the living God. In scientific phrase, the suggestions embraced in their moral code were reflected and reproduced in their psychic manifestations, precisely as the so-called spirit communications of today are reproductions of the medium's conception of the character of the spirit who is supposed to be present. The religion of the Jews was, therefore, necessarily elevated and refined just in accordance with the moral status of their prophets. But their prophets were human. They were subject to all the weaknesses and frailties of common humanity. They were restricted in their progress by the limitations of their environment, and civilization was yet in its infancy. Progress with them was, therefore, necessarily slow and fitful, and was often retarded by those reactionary forces which are always present in every inchoate nation. It was many generations after the death of Moses before any substantial progress was made in the religious evolution of the Jewish people. Their prophets, however, continued to exist, and their influence gradually extended. The source of their inspiration was always the same, for the same suggestions were transmitted from generation to generation. Each prophet believed himself to be in communication with the only living and true God. The separation of the tribes after the death of Moses did not change the dominant idea. Each prophet of all the tribes believed himself to be in communication with the only true God. Each tribe regarded with contempt the gods of the other tribes, as was natural. Nevertheless, the monotheistic idea was dominant with all the prophets. It could not be otherwise, for the inherited suggestion was constantly before each of them that when he entered the psychic state it was because the hand of the Lord was upon him. And his utterances when in that state were necessarily in keeping with the dominant suggestion that he was giving voice to the very words of the living God. Hence the authoritative prefix to all their announcements, "Thus saith the Lord," was uttered in the solemn tones of sincerest conviction. That they were earnest and sincere in their convictions cannot be doubted. Their enthusiasm, which oftentimes developed into fanaticism, could be the result of nothing less than absolute conviction, not only of the truth of their utterances, but of their divine origin and authority. They could not believe otherwise, for they were constantly experiencing phenomena which forced that conviction upon them. They found themselves habitually entering a state that was to them mysterious and abnormal and yet agreeable. In that state they entered into communion with what appeared to them to be an extraneous intelligence. That intelligence sometimes put words into their mouths that were foreign to their objective thoughts. In short, they experienced the same phenomena that modern psychics attribute to disembodied spirits, differing only in the suggestions which gave character to the manifestations. To them, the evidences of divine communion and of their own divine mission were demonstrative. That conviction was communicated to the people, partly by their intense earnestness, and partly by their occasional exhibitions of psychic power in the performance of what was then regarded as miracles, as in the cases of Elijah and Elisha and later by Jesus of Nazareth. It will thus be seen that the monotheistic idea was inherent in the very nature of the psychic phenomena experienced by the seers and prophets of the Jewish race. The first psychic who, no matter how the idea originated, conceived himself to be in communion with God, fixed the monotheistic idea in his own mind and in the minds of his successors for all time. No power on earth could uproot that idea thus formed, so long as there was a succession of psychics to whom the dominating suggestion could be transmitted. Nevertheless, it was an idea that possessed the seeds of future development, in that every step in the progress of a higher civilization correspondingly elevated and refined the popular conception of the deity. We have already seen the advancement of the idea under the dispensation of Moses. Its development after his death was comparatively slow up to the advent of Jesus. Nevertheless, there was substantial progress before that event. The God of Abraham was the God of a tribe. As the tribe enlarged to a nation, he became a national God. But it was not until the days of Isaiah that the idea of God's power and dominion was so enlarged as to give him credit for benevolent intentions towards the whole race of mankind. And he said, "It is a light thing that thou shouldst be my servant to raise up the tribes of Jacob, and to restore the preserved of Israel. I will also give thee for a light to the Gentiles, that thou mayest be my salvation unto the end of the earth." In chapter 9 of Isaiah, there is further vague mention of the benevolent intentions of the God of Israel towards the Gentiles, but it is also evident that the latter were of secondary consideration. Yet it must be confessed, says Mackintosh, that even the prophetic hold of this higher conception was wavering and unsteady, as is conspicuously apparent in the Psalter, where the old popular, or we may say heathenish, and prophetic sentiments follow each other in baffling confusion, in irreconcilable juxtaposition. Not a reader but is surprised, if not pained, to see the breath of vengeance and the breath of mercy blow by turns through those wonderful compositions, which were probably among the last, and were, in some respects, the greatest products of the prophetic spirit. The most substantial progress of the monotheistic idea during the interval between the death of Moses and the advent of Christ consisted not so much in the enlargement of the idea itself as in its general acceptance by the Jewish people. This was brought about by their misfortunes, together with the earnest efforts made by their prophets to convince them that it was to their wickedness, evinced in following after false gods, that their troubles were due. With the details of their history, however, we have little to do. It suffices to know that the monotheistic principle was developed by and through the Jewish people by means of psychic phenomena. As I have before remarked, the fact that it was misunderstood at the time does not militate against the broad truth of the proposition. All the phenomena of nature were misinterpreted in the infancy of the human race, but the laws of nature were the same then as they are now. The advantage that we possess consists in the fact that we know a little more than did the ancients of the laws which pertain to the phenomena of nature. They thought that the earth was flat, and that it was the center of the universe. We know that it is round, and that it constitutes but an infinitesimal part of the universe. We also know that it was round when they lived, and that it will continue to be round as long as it holds together. In other words, with our knowledge of astronomical laws, we can reconstruct the past and foretell the future movements of the heavenly bodies. We also know something of the laws of the soul. It is little, it is true, compared with what is known of the physical sciences, for the fact is just fairly beginning to dawn upon the human mind that the soul can be studied scientifically. But enough is known of the phenomena of the soul to enable us to classify a few of the leading facts and understand something of their significance. The phenomena which we have been discussing have a well-settled place in psychic science, and there is no longer any excuse for misinterpreting them.